Değerli izleyiciler, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugün İstanbul Mimar Sinan Güzel Sanatlar Üniversitesi Şehir ve Bölge Planlama Bölümü, Sel Yayıncılık ve Şehir Plancıları Odası İstanbul Şubesi'nin işbirliğinde gerçekleştireceğimiz birazdan bir organizasyonda hep beraberiz. Bugünkü konuğumuz hepinizin, Türkiye'deki okurların kitaplarından ve aktivist kimliğinden çok yakından tanıdığı Sayın David Harvey. Kendisini üniversitemizde ağırlamaktan büyük bir mutluluk duyuyoruz. Birazdan kendisi konferansına başlayacak. Diğer bir mutluluğumuz da kendisinin son çalışması olan 2014 yılında yazdığı 17 Çelişki ve Kapitalizmin Sonu isimli kitabın Türkçe'ye çok kısa bir sürede çevrilmiş olması. Ve bu kitabın ilk defa yine okuyucularla buluşması üniversitemiz ortamında gerçekleşiyor. Bu açıdan da çok büyük bir mutluluk duyuyoruz. Ben hepinize öncelikle geldiğiniz için teşekkür ediyorum. Ve tabii en büyük teşekkür de bizlerle birlikte olduğu için Sayın David Harvey'e. Çok teşekkürler.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and coming out and on a nice day. I want to thank my publisher, Sel, very much, not only for this translation, but for several translations which they have done. And I want to thank the Chamber of Planning also for helping to stage this event. And I really appreciate the effort put in. Marx once said when he was asked what he was up to in his studies of capital, was that he said he was preparing a terrible missile to be hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie and the landlords. I think that is actually one of the reasons why Marx and Marx's works are so dangerous, is precisely because they have that quality to them. And when I prepared the manuscript of 17 Contradictions, my publisher friend, who's actually helped publish most of my books in English, who's always been a great supporter of my work, but never an uncritical supporter. He remarked that he thought this book was perhaps the most important one I'd ever written. And I was thinking afterwards, having thanked him for his vote of confidence, I was thinking afterwards that maybe it's the most dangerous book I've ever written, for a variety of reasons which I want to get into. But it also happens to be a book that comes at the end of a whole sequence of books, which in retrospect I refer to as the Marx Project. Now I say in retrospect because I had no idea when I started that it was going to turn into this project. And it's only in the last couple of years I've realized that this is what I've been doing. In effect, the project has, in a funny sort of way, taken over my life. It began towards the end of the 1990s. And I was actually looking forward to the year 2000 because it was supposed to be the year of my retirement. And I was really quite looking forward to going off and doing what the hell I liked. So here I am 15 years later, 12 books later. My God, what happened? Something strange happened. One of the strange things that happened was that I moved to the City University of New York in 2001. And I moved from a private university with a lot of misery and pain and went to a public institution which was actually concerned with creating a public. And to the degree that it's a public university and pays lower salaries than the most famous universities in New York, which are Columbia and NYU, City University of New York has faculty that by and large neither Columbia nor NYU would ever care to hire. So the result is there's a bunch of radicals in CUNY, which turns out to be a very nice atmosphere. And of course it's a huge university. It has nearly 500,000 students. Nobody knows that, but we do. We have a graduate school which is actually very active and politically active. So I suddenly found myself in this new environment with some fabulous students who took over the idea that if I was going to teach capital to, say, 100 people in a lecture, it might just as well put it on the web. So it was their idea to create the website. It was their idea to film the Marx lectures, which have been actually quite influential worldwide. And so I owe them a great deal of thanks. They also did some marvelous things. I'm not very competent with the new media technologies. So I remember at some point somebody said, "We follow you on Twitter." And I said, "What? I don't have a Twitter." And they said, "Yes, you do." And they showed me. But of course, it was my students who were twittering on my behalf. So if any of you following me on Twitter, you know it's them, not me. So this was a rather wonderful experience. But it also occurred to me, of course, that Marx, it seems to me, has been very badly understood. And in part, of course, this comes from all the right-wing distortions and the like. Part of it also comes from simple ignorance and fear of communism or Marxism or whatever. Some of it, unfortunately, also comes from the left because there are some, I think, very dogmatic readings of Marx in the history of Marxism, which did not seem to me to work very well with the texts that I was teaching. And so it seemed to me that there was a very good case for trying to lay out a more accessible approach to Marx. And I emphasize the more accessible because there is a lot of Marx scholarship in the academy. Much of it seems to be dedicated to making Marx even more complicated than he already is. And while I think there's a lot to admire in some of that, it seems to me that working on Marx in that way misses the point. So what I wanted to do in the lectures and in the companions to Marx's Capital, what I wanted to do was to sort of open a door, as it were, to Marx's thinking, so that people could go through that and work out for themselves what it was that they would want to take out of this text. And I had learned from teaching it to multiple audiences, including people in prison, that different people took different things out of it, and in many respects, what they took out of it was equally valid. That is, a philosopher reading Marx sees different things in it than a sociologist or a social worker, and academics see something different than social movement people. And I think that's okay. I don't think there's one reading of Marx that needs to be sustained. So it was in that spirit that we put the lectures on the web inviting people to read the texts, and then the written versions came out as companions, and I thought the word companion as opposed to introduction was very important. It's like I wanted to be somebody's companion walking through this text, not saying to them, this is what you've got to believe, but hey, what do you see? How do you see it? What does it look like? How do you understand things? And that, of course, was just part of what the Marx project was about. But also in teaching these texts, I'd always been very concerned with some very important questions. And perhaps one of the most important questions was, what is it that we can actually learn from Marx? And what is it that we have to do for ourselves in order to understand the world around us? That is, there is a distinction, it seems to me, between what Marx managed to accomplish and how he managed to accomplish it. And I'm profoundly admiring of that. And how we use that information, those ideas, to interpret and understand where we are right now. And this poses certain problems of figuring out in what respects Marx's ideas are dated back to the mid-19th century, to what degree we need to introduce new elements. And as Marx and Engels wrote in their introduction to the 1872 edition of the Communist Manifesto, any historical materialist has to go back to the beginning and reevaluate everything that is said back then for what the situation is right now. And that seemed to me to be an important part of teaching the text, to say, well, this is what Marx said at the time, this is how he saw it, and this is in relationship to the things that were going on around him at the time. He didn't see certain things that are going on around us, so we now have to think about how we approach that text and bring it into our present. And in this sense, it seemed to me very important to construe Marxism as a living tradition. It's not a dead scriptural reading of the gospel according to Karl Marx. It is a living tradition, and it is to bring life into it that it seemed to me to be absolutely crucial to teach it that way. But in teaching it that way, not only to ask that big question, what is it that Marx can do for us, and what is it that we have to do for ourselves, to be able also to think through certain issues which Marx left unfinished and which needed to be updated, and to think through also how certain elements within Marx's text do indeed resound with us today in very, very clear ways. I became very impressed in the 1990s, the more globalization and neoliberalization and all the rest of it became significant, that the reports on labor processes in Bangladesh or in Mexico or in Indonesia or in China, that you could take those reports and you could put them into Marx's chapter on the working day and you would not see any difference. That is, there was a sense in which the movement of history after 1970 or so was moving capital back closer and closer to that kind of world which Marx described. That the length of the working day, which was absolutely crucial in Marx's analysis, was becoming more and more significant. When I was working in Baltimore on the living wage campaign, I was talking with people who were working 80-hour weeks in order to get enough income to survive. I was talking to people who had absolutely no time for political organization, had no time to think, whose time was completely taken up, both in the living space and in the workspace, by designated tasks for which they became exhausted at the end of every working day. So when you come to this, you would say, there are things going on as we would go through Capital that you suddenly have these light bulbs and say, yes, it's exactly like that now. The creation of industrial reserve armies, the creation of disposable populations, which Marx talks about in Volume 1 of Capital. These were, I think, very significant. So one of the things I also tried to do, not only in teaching Marx, was to try to illustrate how the understanding that I had of Marx as laid out in the 2 volumes of the Companions to Capital helped me to dissect, deconstruct, understand many of the issues that were going on around us. So I wrote a book about the new imperialism. I wrote about the history of neoliberalism. I wrote about the enigma of capital. I wrote about the 17 contradictions, in all of which I was really using the conceptual apparatus that Marx uses, but adapted that conceptual apparatus to try to dissect what is happening in contemporary capitalism and how contemporary capitalism works. At the same time, I was also following a lifelong interest in urbanization. So there were 3 books on urbanization. The book on Spaces of Hope, the Paris book, of course, and Rebel Cities. And all of those books were teaching me things about Marx's conceptual apparatus, which either validated the conceptual apparatus or said, this conceptual apparatus doesn't work very well. So the question then arose, how can we make the conceptual apparatus operate more effectively? How can we design it more effectively? So it was like a perpetual dialogue going on between the conceptual theoretical apparatus on the one hand and the investigation into questions of urban dynamics, uneven geographical development, imperialism, neoliberalism, and the like. And it's that conversation which became very significant that led me in many ways to start to reconfigure my understanding of Marx in relationship to contemporary concerns. But Marx is such an interesting study because you come up with an empirical idea on the basis of something like the Paris study, and you see something happening and you say, oh, well, that's theoretically very important. Then you go back into Marx and you find, actually, he talked about that. You just didn't see it when you were reading it theoretically. And so this then became another part of what I was talking about. Now, each one of these books had a particular target. Neoliberalism, obvious target. Imperialism, another obvious target. The Enigma of Capital was built around the question, what happened in 2007, 2008? How do we interpret the crisis then? And the urban books, obviously, had their own particular targets. So this brings me to the question, what was my target in 17 Contradictions? And why, in pursuing that target, did I create a book that I think is actually quite dangerous? The target was really twofold. First, I wanted to define what it might mean to be anti-capitalist. I found myself in an environment in which a lot of people would say, oh, I'm anti-capitalist. Yeah, I'm anti-capitalist. I don't want to be called communist. That's too messy. And besides, you might get your head chopped off in the wrong parts of the world for that. So I'll just say I'm anti-capitalist. And then if you ask people what they meant by that, they give you a vague answer. So it seemed to me important to try to define, all right, what does it really mean to be anti-capitalist? And then I wanted to go one step further is I wanted to actually do a study of capital to show why it would be rational for everybody to be anti-capitalist. Why it is rational for you to be anti-capitalist. And I say rational because this is not based on emotion or anything like that. It's based on an analysis. And in this sense, I do still cling to the idea of Marx as a scientist trying to really understand the nature of the world we live in, and to trying to do it not in a scientistic way, but in, I think, a very clear and very measured way. So I wanted to do those two things. And the question then arose, how best to do that? I decided to do it by looking at the notion of contradiction. And here too, it seemed to me there was something that needed to be cleared up. Marxists are very fond of talking about contradictions. But actually it turns out, again, this is a sort of a bit of a problematic concept. There are certain contradictions of capital that are well known. Capital, labor, productive forces versus social relations. And there's a tendency always to sort of mention those as being the great destabilizers of what capital is about. But beyond that, there are always these kinds of other issues that arise. And one of the things that I had noticed over the years, and in fact, I had indulged in this myself, was that when you encountered something you couldn't understand or didn't make any sense whatsoever, you would just throw up your hands and say, well, it's the contradictions of capital, isn't it? And everybody would say, oh, yeah, okay. And it was like a conversation stopper. And I thought, actually, we should take the idea of contradiction and make it a conversation starter, in which we would ask the question, what are the contradictions which we face? So I did what I've done before, which is to sort of whiz through the 3 volumes of Capital and go through my notes on the theories of surplus value and all the rest of it. And I came up with, I have to say, rather more than 17 contradictions that Marx talks about. So I decided, rather than talk about 57 contradictions, that I'd try to configure what it seemed to me were the main ones which were significant, and some of the contradictions actually merge into others. And so I came up with a magic number of 17, and I kind of figured that was enough. And the 17 contradictions then was a way of starting to look at this dynamic of capital accumulation and its destabilizing possibilities. In this, I found actually some very interesting features, because one of the things, as I've always discovered as a writer, is that you start off writing something thinking you know what it is you want to write. And by the time you get to the end, you've written something completely different. And this is actually one of the wonderful things about writing. I mean, it's sometimes one of the very frustrating things about writing and drives you mad. But at the same time, it is absolutely fascinating. And one of the things I found was that these contradictions locked together in certain very interesting ways, and that you could not actually understand one contradiction without understanding its relationship to other contradictions. Just to begin with the most obvious contradiction that occurs on page 1 of Capital, the contradiction between use value and exchange value. A commodity has a dual character. And we regard the commodity differently, whether we're thinking about it in terms of its use value or its exchange value. And we do different things with it on its use value and exchange value. And in the book, I use the example of housing, kind of saying, well, housing is a use value, describe that in all sorts of different ways. In our society, it also has an exchange value. And we've been told again and again and again that actually the most efficient way in which use values can be provided to a population is by creating an exchange value system which actually then drives the production of the use values. And this is the most efficient way to provide housing. And of course, this all went terribly, terribly wrong in 2007, 2008. The exchange value system absolutely destroyed the access of housing to something like 14 million households in the United States. 14 million households lost their houses. It was a huge transfer of wealth and asset wealth. Certain vulnerable populations, African Americans, Hispanic migrants, lost vast amounts of their asset wealth. Calculations are that those populations lost about 80%, 70% of their asset wealth. This was a phenomenal loss. At the same time, the Wall Street bankers were pulling in bonuses of billions of dollars. So this is the huge transfer, and this is what the exchange value system was doing. The result was use values were not being provided. But when you look back, you saw very clearly that the bottom half of the population in the United States has never been provided with adequate use values in housing by the exchange value system that had been constructed after the 1930s onwards. In fact, it is a class-biased system. But that exchange value, use value contradiction cannot be dealt with outside of the contradiction between value, which is the social labor which we do for each other as mediated through the market system, and its measure, which is money. And there's a contradiction between value and its representation. But clearly, exchange value doesn't mean anything unless there is a monetary form of representation. So exchange value and use value cannot be understood independent of the contradiction between value and its representative, the money form. Furthermore, the money form does not make sense unless there is private property. And private property cannot exist without its guarantor, which is the state. So you get the state-private property contradiction, which supports the monetary value contradiction, which supports the exchange value, use value contradiction. Furthermore, there's something very, very interesting about the monetary representation. See, social labor is a social relation. And social relations have no direct measure, which is why you need a measuring rod, i.e. the monetary system. And this monetary system has a certain character, in that it is, like all representations, it falsifies at the same time as it represents. The classic example of this for we geographers is, of course, the map. The map represents, but it also distorts and falsifies. And you have to know what it distorts and what it falsifies in order to really use it as a representation. I mean, you've all seen those map projections, right, where the world is sort of divided up into those weird segments, like segments of an orange and spread out on a table. Well, if the world was actually like that, I mean, that would be ridiculous. but that is a valid representation of the world according to certain mathematical principles. And as we know, there are certain distortions that make certain parts of the world look much larger than other parts of the world. The Mercator protection makes Greenland look like one of the biggest pieces of territory on the Earth, which of course it's not. So the map distorts at the same time as it represents. Money distorts at the same time as it represents. And one of its big distortions is that it allows the private appropriation of social wealth. And the private appropriation of social wealth, of course, underpins the accumulation of wealth on the part of significant elements in the population that can then, of course, form a capitalist class. So you see these contradictions relating to each other and supporting each other and working with each other. And the contradictions have this habit of getting out of control. I've mentioned the use value, exchange value contradiction, which actually lay at the root of the crisis of 2007-2008 in housing markets. But that would not make sense if you didn't have the contradiction in the monetary form, so that speculative activity and monetary applications and fictitious capital flying through housing markets played a very important role in the formation of that crisis, as also did the contradictory relationship between state and private property, as did the class relation. So here's, if you like, the sense in which I was developing these ideas of contradictions. And in so doing, we started to demonstrate that we could start to distinguish between certain contradictions which are foundational for how capital works. That is, the use value, exchange value contradiction is going to be there in any capitalist society. Doesn't matter what time or place. But this is rather different from some other contradictions which are highly changeable over time. For instance, the contradictions that surround technology are constantly evolving. The evolution of new technologies and technological dynamics. And technological dynamism is no longer something which is forced by competition between individuals, because technological dynamism has itself become big business. Marx comments on this. It means that actually there is a whole sector of our economy that is actually working constantly to produce new technologies, whether we need them or not. And very often what happens is the new technologies come on board and there's not a use for them, so a use has to be created, a need has to be created. And it's not only true of new technologies, it's also true of new products. When the drug Prozac came on the market, there was no disease to fit it. So they had to actually invent a disease to fit the product.